Nevertheless, the West made the incredible intellectual sort of breakthrough around this time of pluralism and freedom of intellectual expression. In the 16th century, Martin Luther and John Calvin had succeeded in bringing about a major religious reform in Europe. They were the first to tackle some of the dogmas of the ancient faith of Christianity and subject them to individual reason. The revolt against the church and the split it caused was one of the leading causes of the numerous wars of religion that raged across Europe between the mid-16th and the mid-17th centuries. The French Wars of Religion between 1562 to 1598, the English Civil War, the 80 Years' War between Spain and the Netherlands, divided Europe along the lines of faith and turned the whole continent into an on-off killing field. Then the 13 Years' War, especially in 1680 to 1648, enveloped the majority of Central and Eastern Europe and killed millions, and was the most devastating of these conflicts. Desperate to avoid a repeat of this barbarous war, theologians tried to initiate religious reform. Meanwhile, Enlightenment scholars wanted to remove the power of organized religion altogether. Eventually, Locke, the likes of John Locke, would come along, and they would eventually, develop this kind of liberal idea, classical liberal idea of the tolerance for all religious Christian sort of sects, and that all Christians had the right to freely practice their religion. Theologians sought to avoid conflict by restoring faith to its very roots, advocating a study of the Word of God alone in the optimistic hope that everyone would agree on its literal interpretation. John Locke carried out what he deemed to be an unprejudiced examination of the Bible and first promoted the idea of separation of church and state. Locke argued that the state had no authority when it came to individual conscience and that a rational society must be responsible for their own moral code. These ideas were instrumental in the development of the American colonies and instructed Thomas Jefferson in drafting the United States Constitution. Jefferson called for a wall of separation between church and state and penned the Jefferson Bible, a text that put the moral code of the New Testament at its forefront and gave no mention of miraculous events or Jesus Christ's resurrection. An interesting point that Dr. Caroll Quigley raised and mentioned in his book Tragedy and Hope was that the Western tradition had become one that emphasized pluralism, diversity of thought, freedom of expression, and approximations to the truth, but never the final answer. And all of these sought to inform the understanding of Western civilization for about the last few centuries, where there was increasing emphasis on free expression and diversity of outlook. Of course, this hasn't always been perfectly applied, and people have been persecuted for their beliefs, and there have been various forms of censorship. But in general, the Western tradition emphasized these aspects of free expression. This is in opposition to perhaps other civilizations which may have initially had these aspects, or may have developed these aspects, or indeed their traditions may support these aspects, but they may not fully apply them due to other factors. One point to be mentioned here, however, is there's a fundamental flaw with the secular project, in that on a very fundamental basis, everybody has a religion, and I may be using this in a much broader sense or in a less narrow sense, but if we understand religion as a set or series of metaphysical propositions, claims, and assumptions that one agrees with, and they fundamentally inform his worldview, like deeper underlying spiritual truths about the universe, and fundamentally, on a fundamental basis, everybody has these, then in reality, everybody has a religion. And in reality, all different kinds of political ideologies and all different kinds of thoughts and schools of thinking, they can be considered as religions insofar as they are a set of codes or rules that dictate the way one runs his life. In this sense, humanism or secular liberalism or communism can also be considered very much as religions. In fact, Gramsci went as far as to call Marxism a secular religion. And you can see this manifesting in many, for example, many communist countries where you have cults of personality around, let's say, Stalin or Mao, and even, let's say, in America right now where you have Trump. Quite frankly, Trump also has a cult of personality. And so we see that all of these political traditions and ideologies do have a certain mythic element to them. And by myth, I would be referring to, first of all, traditions and stories and basic assumptions about the world, but also secondly certain mythic figures of heroism and sort of courage and bravery. And we can see this within the liberal worldview as well, for example, the American founding fathers may be viewed in such a manner, and there may be basic assumptions in the liberal worldview, such as that, a community of shared interests, or the fact that men sort of are inherently good and they are corrupted by the forces of society around them. For example, the statement that man is born free but in chains everywhere, and that if we simply limited the power of the state, we could work towards, let's say, a utopic world. These are very much religious assumptions about the world, and these assumptions of equality are very much religious in nature and aren't necessarily scientific propositions to begin with. Even if, various philosophies based on the Enlightenment project, such as communism or liberalism, may purport to be scientific in nature, in reality they are ought claims disguised as is propositions. And in that sense, if we consider these various ideologies to be religious in nature, then the whole point of them being supposedly secular collapses. Now, a couple of points to be mentioned here. This isn't necessarily me arguing against egalitarianism, or liberty. The reality is that these are important principles and truths of human existence, but they aren't the end all and be all, and furthermore, they operate within a wider system of values, and they are balanced out by other important aspects of human existence. For example, authority, purity, and virtue. So, all of these various aspects, whether they be liberty, fraternity, egalitarianism, fairness, justice, and authority, purity, and virtue, they are all important. And a sound metaphysical or philosophical system, which obviously in the Western context or in an Islamic context, let's say, would be based in religion, but also within the various philosophical teachings and systems developed, let's say, by the Greeks or by the Muslims and the Christians over thousands of years. A metaphysical system like that, which employed and understood all of these various values and aspects of the human existence in their proper context, in their proper place, with each of them balancing each other out, thus avoiding the extremities of overemphasizing one value over another. Such a metaphysical philosophical system would correctly employ these values and correctly sustain these values. Thus, a system based on, let's say, religious values and a metaphysical worldview, which correctly employed the principles of liberty and, let's say, fairness and justice, would be very successful in sustaining these values and maintaining their philosophical or metaphysical importance for the human existence, rather than simply having, like a secular materialist worldview where you can't really scientifically prove these concepts. These concepts can only really be operationalized in the first place under a philosophical metaphysical worldview. These things don't really mean anything in a scientific worldview, because what does it mean to scientifically measure equality and liberty? And if anything, most human societies throughout history have been quite unequal and quite illiberal. So the only way to sustain these things would be in a philosophical, metaphysical, and in a religious worldview. Also, you know, although a society would be based off religious values, it's important for a society not to be dogmatic, and it's important not to have a overly overbearing view of religion where you just enforce religious rituals and dogma onto people and they become overburdened. So whilst a government should be based on general religious values and assumptions, it shouldn't enforce religion onto the people. So we should emphasize liberty and authority and freedom and fairness and egalitarianism within a religious framework that can properly operationalize these concepts, but also take into account other values and balance out these and not go into extremes regarding them.